about the jewel thief.
Great.
And I'm pretty sure you had a thrill on making this documentary because it's not usual that you get to interact with your subject too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a little bizarre that we've come to be pretty friendly, speak on more or less a daily basis these days, not a turn that I expected my life to take.
Yeah. And one of the highlights as I was watching was how there seems to be a clash in the stories. The mom would be saying one version, like say about the milk, and then he'd, he'd, he'd be like, no, that's not the case. There's the press that was present outside the police station, but reality was not the case. So, how do you're the one interviewing everybody. So, how did you handle that part?
I think that was kind of part of the fascinating thing to me at the beginning, that, this guy has this long, illustrious career as a criminal, but, seemed to actually want the attention. He wanted the recognition from it, and I think that there was a real sort of mythology that was built up around him. How much of that was generated by him and how much was generated by the press, is probably up for debate. But I think early on we kind of decided to lean into that mythology and lean into the fact that there are a lot of different stories, and a lot of this has kind of been exaggerated and puffed up maybe, but for me, and I think that experience of assuming that, a lot of these kind of larger than life tales were BS, and then, the ones that sounded the most outlandish and the most hard to believe for me ended up being completely true, and people verified them, and maybe a detail here and there were trumped up a little bit, but, the stories by and large all check out, and he really did, do all of these things that are just so hard to wrap your head around.
What was it like finally getting to interview him after already knowing a massive part of his story and just like listen to him and this really in mind?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very unique experience for me, honestly, with the types of projects I've done. Usually I get to know a person pretty well before I kind of meet them in that capacity. But in this case, I had a decade of sort of reading and learning about this guy and all of these stories about him before I ever met him. By the time I met him, he was a celebrity in my mind, and I could kind of put him on a certain pedestal. And I think meeting him in person is a little unnerving because he's just a very polite, very kind of soft spoken at times, a little preoccupied usually, and just so blunt and so matter of fact about all of these things that it's just like, of course everybody dreamed of robbing banks their whole life, like that's what that's what you dream about when you're a child, and some of these things are just so hard not to be kind of taken aback by, but it's all just so common for him and so kind of matter of fact, that it's just really, yeah, it definitely takes you back a little bit to see just how even keel he can be about a lot of these just, in most cases completely absurd kind of stories and tales.
He does say in the documentary that most people just fantasize about doing things, but yet he had the courage, I was going to say another word, to execute them.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think I think ultimately what I've been just so fascinated by is just his mindset and what he kind of takes as normal and how he kind of sees, what he did and what he accomplished, and that he has a true sense of pride in that. And I'm just always so amazed, I think like a lot of people, I first kind of heard about this just because of this one jewel heist in Austria. And I think people that know him know of that, very specific heist. But just as I, really kind of dug into this, there's just so much more. And just every, kind of scheme and plot that he executed was more outlandish than the last. And he just was always sort of dreaming bigger and coming up with bigger and more elaborate heists and things to outdo himself constantly. And, you know, what he calls an addiction, and honestly what I see as really just an obsession and a true ambition, to pull these kinds of things off and to really, live up to this persona that he created as a true, real life criminal mastermind. But just amazing to me to see kind of what what drives that, how someone kind of becomes that.
That was definitely his high.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's
And
funny. I in talking to him, I'm always kind of like, is it just this sort of adrenaline? Is it this yada yada? And he would always say no, like it's like by the time I'm doing it, it's boring because I'm so well prepared, like it's not a high, it's not a this, but yeah, he would just come back to calling it an addiction always, and that it's just like an impulse, something that he had to do, and that he'd spend so much time kind of thinking these things through and fantasizing them that by the time he did them it was all just kind of clockwork.
so, what was the process in approaching him and getting all this footage that he owns that's his from
Yeah,
the beginning of his life?
it was a pretty long process, but I think it was, again, I think just sort of building up to this idea that he really, seems to me that he wanted that recognition, he wanted that notoriety. And I think, as a documentary filmmaker, you sort of find out that there's this trove of existing materials that just kind of makes you salivate. It was definitely a process of tracking a lot of this stuff down. I mean, a lot of things that he had kind of stashed away in shoe boxes here and there, and things that his mother had in some cases, but a lot of it had been confiscated as well by the police and was sort of thought to have been destroyed, and lots of different channels and things. But just this kind of great scavenger hunt once you know that these things exist, to try to put all those pieces together. But I had read about these materials, and interviewed people that said, as they say in the film, that his great downfall was that he documented everything. He had all these records of all these incredible escapades that he went on. But so I lost my train of thought. But I think just so knowing that those things exist was such a process of really kind of being able to track those down and sort of bring them out. And you know they, like I said, they'd been written about, but nobody's ever seen them before. I mean, this is the first time that any of those things have ever been made public. So yeah, just an incredible gift as a filmmaker.
Now, speaking, you mentioned, interviewing people for this documentary. You had several that I was surprised to see the biological dad, but is there someone that declined to be interviewed?
There were a lot of people that declined, honestly. And I think that that's, it was important to me going into this that, he seemed to have a real sort of moral compass to an extent. There was a line that he wouldn't cross. And I think the fact that no one was ever hurt, that I mean, to my knowledge, and certainly not in any court records, there was no violence involved in any of his crimes, that no one was, hurt physically, I'll say, by any of these crimes that I know of. But and I think that kind of gave us some license to have fun with the story, to use a relatively light tone in a lot of cases. But I do think that he clearly has a bit of a dark streak in him, and a lot of people have sort of pointed to him being vengeful in a lot of ways, and a lot of people were afraid of that kind of blowback and repercussions. But obviously so many of the people on both sides of the fence, let's say his family and people in law enforcement, and people that were alongside him in a lot of cases, were very willing to talk, and just, I think, makes it for a very unique experience to hear directly from him, directly from the police that spent years and years investigating him, and several who were humiliated by him, and people that know him in a lot of different contexts. It's very, very interesting to get that kind of complete 360 on a character, somebody who clearly wears a lot of hats. So
Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And this is definitely a very interesting story, and not to mention the enjoyment of watching the old archives.
well, great. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you. Bye bye.